Hello YouTube, and welcome back to another episode of Comics Explained from Lazy Kid Entertainment. In the last video we discussed Ultimate Peter Parker, and in this one we get to discuss his successor, Miles Morales. Alright, so let's first start with the creation of the character. The idea of a black Spider-Man first came about in late 2008 during the election of President Barack Obama. Author Brian Michael Bendis and artist Sarah Pichelli got together and designed the character in around 2010. This was after a huge online campaign for actor and rapper Donald Glover to portray Peter Parker in the Amazing Spider-Man reboot, which was coming out in 2012. The character design is based off of an amalgam of Donald Glover and President Obama's faces. Donald Glover actually ended up voicing the character in his animated debut in Disney XD's Ultimate Spider-Man television series. The thought process behind the creation of the character came about when Brian Michael Bendis realized Spider-Man didn't have to be white. Spider-Man could be anything. In fact, the thing that most people enjoyed about Peter Parker as a character was that he was a relatable teenager. Under that mask, it could be anyone. The story of Miles Morales takes place in the Ultimate Universe, Earth 1610. It takes place a little bit before the death of Peter Parker, and we see Norman Osborn working on genetically engineering spiders, kind of like he did with the one that bit Peter, trying to duplicate Spider-Man's powers. We see him discussing with another scientist the importance of these spiders. Then later that night, a masked robber breaks into Oscorp headquarters and steals the spider. This masked robber is revealed to be the Prowler. Now the Prowler we'll get into a little bit later in the video, but basically it's Miles' uncle Aaron Davis. Now when we first meet Miles, we are introduced to him with his parents, and they're going to an admissions lottery for a gifted boarding school in New York City. Just a little bit about Miles. He's a 13-year-old biracial young man. His mom is Puerto Rican and his dad is African American, making him the first black Spider-Man. So in issue number 1, after the lottery and after Miles' acceptance into the boarding school, he goes to visit his Uncle Aaron. Uncle Aaron lives in a simple apartment in New York City. At this point in the story, Miles has no idea of his uncle's criminal behavior. And so when Miles is sitting on the couch, the spider breaks free of its containment and bites Miles on the hand. Miles freaks out and then passes out and escapes his uncle's apartment. Now I think I'm going to take this time to segue into Miles' powers after the spider bite, because while he is Spider-Man and while he does hold a lot of the traditional powers of Spider-Man, he has some that make him very, very unique, and we'll get into that in a second. During his original run, he is portrayed to be a little bit weaker than Peter Parker, but again, that is sheer inexperience. We'll come to see a little bit later on that Miles is actually a lot more powerful than the traditional Peter Parker, and you find that out once they meet, which we'll discuss in depth later on. Being of Hispanic descent, Miles is also bilingual, which really isn't a superpower, but it's a nice touch to the character and just adds something to him as a whole. And now, let's get into what makes Miles really special. And it's really cool here, because Miles has a series of extra powers that the original Peter Parker does not possess. The first of which is known as the Venom Blast, or Venom Strike, or Venom Sting. Different characters call it different things. Miles usually refers to it as the Venom Blast. What it is a bioelectric charge that he can dispel from his fingers. What he does is he usually touches it, and then about 3 to 5 seconds later, the person is struck with what the comic writers have described as essentially getting kicked in the balls. Miles is very quick to use this and often deploys it against most of his enemies. It's a great way of balancing the fact that he has these new powers and doesn't have a Spider-Man to train him to use them, and doesn't have all of the experience that Peter Parker did. It's a quick way to take villains out without having the great power, great responsibility speech, or even Peter's wrestling training, so he knew combat. Miles also possesses a slightly enhanced version of Peter Parker's spider sense. It goes a little bit further than Peter Parker's because it grants him basically precognition, which allows him to kind of see into the future or predict other events as long as they relate to him. Because he was bitten before Ultimate Peter Parker's death, he wakes up with a dream of Electro bursting into his dorm room and saying, "Must kill Spider-Man." This dream is followed up very shortly by him and the rest of the school being called into the gymnasium, and they are informed that Peter Parker has just now died. So now, about issue 3, it has caught up with the death of Peter Parker. Now, along with the Venom Blast, he can also turn that into a variety of different attacks, such as the Venom Punch, which is he takes the bioelectric energy into a punch that very easily knocks enemies down and knocks them out. Miles also has what I think is the more appropriate term of the Venom Blast, where he can charge up this energy and disperse it from his body, causing a large explosion. Now, when Miles first used this power, it drained him immediately after, and he wasn't really able to go on after that for some time until he's rested. But after use and after maturity and after experience, Miles is able to use this attack in combat and still be effective. Lately, Miles has displayed a new ability called Energy Web, which is basically the Venom Blast, but he can disperse organic webs which allow him to swing from buildings or knock out enemies just by swinging around them or tying them up with them. This also drains Miles a little bit, but to a lesser extent than the Venom Blast.
Miles also has the ability to camouflage himself in the clothes he's wearing to the surrounding environments. It's kind of like invisibility. He becomes undetectable to most enemies, including Peter Parker's spider sense.
Okay, now that we've talked a little bit about who Miles is and what he can do, let's talk about some of his amazing friends. Let's start off with his best friend, Genki. Genki is a kid who he meets and ends up being his roommate. Genki is basically the best friend you could ever want and the best friend you could ever have. Now, here's the cool one, Prowler. Prowler is also known as Aaron Davis. Prowler is a classic Marvel character from the main Marvel universe, but he went by a different name. In the Ultimate Universe, he's a super thief. Well, he's basically just a criminal with a heart of gold. He ends up dying in combat while fighting Miles, and he's basically Miles's main villain. Now, fun little bit of trivia, in Spider-Man Homecoming, Aaron Davis is portrayed by Donald Glover. In a deleted scene from that movie, he actually calls up Miles by name. Now, the other important people in Miles's life are his parents. Rio Morales is Miles's mom. She's a nurse. She loves and supports her son, but is very strict and wants him to be absolutely the most successful. You know how moms are. In the Ultimate Universe, she eventually becomes the only person to find out about Miles' secret identity and is killed when the Venom symbiote attacks Miles at her place of work. She dies telling Miles not to tell his father. Now, her death is not permanent, as when Miles joins the mainstream Marvel 616 universe after Secret Wars, she is resurrected, and then the roles of who knows Miles' secret identity are reversed when Miles' father finds out in that universe. Now, getting into Miles' father. Miles' dad is named Jefferson Davis and has a secret history with S.H.I.E.L.D., both in the Ultimate Universe and when he crosses over into the mainstream Marvel universe. Miles' dad is very strict and doesn't really like the idea of Spider-Man, let alone it being his son. But after finding out that Miles is Spider-Man, he sees how good his son is as the superhero, and he comes to embrace that fact. Now it's time to get into some of the weird stuff. Alright, Miles crosses over into the mainstream Marvel universe a couple of times before he is finally placed there. One time is during the X-Men crossover, which we're not going to get into. The main story is the Spider-Man crossover, which takes place about 1 year after Miles' comic debut as Spider-Man. In the story, mainstream Peter Parker is just, doing mainstream Peter Parker stuff, saving the world and whatnot. He runs across a warehouse owned by Mysterio. Now, this is my little theory tangent. Mysterio is going to be in the next Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man Far From Home, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. Now, what I think would be a really, really interesting thing to do, especially with the course Marvel is taking with their films, was if they could take plot elements of this and kind of introduce Miles Morales as a character into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, especially since we're maybe going to be missing some Avengers. I don't know how Avengers Endgame is going to turn out, but we might need some new superheroes, and I think it would be awesome if we could get a live-action version of Miles Morales. But I digress. During the story, we see the mainstream Peter Parker sent to the Ultimate Universe by Mysterio, and upon his arrival, he stops a robbery, and the person he saves thanks him, but says, that costume's kind of in poor taste, because as we discussed last time, that universe's version of Peter Parker is dead, and everyone knows that he is Spider-Man now. So, because this is a comic book, and in comic books everything is really coincidental, after saving the guy from the robbery, Peter runs right into Miles Morales. And this little introduction is really cool, because then we get kind of a comparison to who's better at what, who's stronger. Now, like I said, the mainstream Peter Parker has been Spider-Man for years at this point, whereas Miles has only been it for about, as he puts it, 5 minutes. You see the similarities in their personalities. Both are very quick to wisecrack and make little quips. Both are very witty and just kind of goofy characters. Now, because you can't justify a crossover like this without having the two Spider-Man go against each other at some point, after a quick battle of wits, they have a battle of powers. Peter is confused because he doesn't know that he's in a different universe. So we get kind of a lengthy little battle. It basically takes up the whole first issue of the comic, where Peter and Miles fight each other. They try and unmask each other and kind of figure out what's going on. Miles eventually gets the upper hand by using his Venom sting on Peter, knocking him unconscious. Now, what happens then is he takes him to that universe's Nick Fury. Another little side tangent is in the year 2000, when the Ultimate Universe was created, Brian Michael Bendis personally went and asked Samuel L. Jackson if he could use his likeness, and Marvel got the okay to do that. So the ultimate version of Nick Fury is black and looks like the version that we see in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it was always supposed to be Sam Jackson. So even before his appearance in that post-credit scene in the first Iron Man movie, it was always intended for Samuel L. Jackson to play the traditionally white Nick Fury. So we get a little conversation between Sam Jackson, or Nick Fury, and Peter Parker, and Peter basically kind of puts everything together after having a chance to just comprehend everything that's going on. So Peter is let go. Sam Jackson, then my bad, Nick Fury then introduces him officially officially to Miles Morales, and Miles kind of shows him around the world. Then basically immediately after, they are attacked by Mysterio, who is in the Ultimate Universe using some form of robotic. Now, again, going along with my theory, the version of the armor that Mysterio is using during this storyline looks almost identical to what the leaked set photos of the Mysterio armor is looking like in Spider-Man Far From Home. So I guess fingers crossed that maybe we might be getting a post-credit scene with Miles Morales, which would, oh my god, that would just, I would cry. I would be like so ecstatic. If I would just be so excited if like Miles Morales just showed up in live action. I don't know who would play him. I don't really even care at this point. I just want it to happen. Anyway, I guess I should explain Mysterio. Mysterio is a former stuntman who kind of went crazy and has a real knack for special effects. So what he does is he developed some sort of serum that causes mass hallucinations against its victims. So what he does, he releases some chemicals into the waters that Miles and Peter fall into, and this causes them to see the various villains that they have both faced. Basically the who's who of all their villains. There's Electro here, there's a version of the Green Goblin, there's Venom. Now normally when Mysterio uses illusions, they're not tangible, you can't like touch them, you can't punch the illusions, they're all psychological. But this chemical is way more advanced, but they're actually able to be hurt. Now this next part really isn't relevant, except for when I was rereading it, I kind of got the feel, so I kind of wanted to show it and explain it. Peter escapes from that situation and goes to visit the Ultimate Universe's version of Aunt May and Gwen Stacy. Now because Peter, the mainstream Peter Parker, still doesn't know that his ultimate counterpart has died, or even how he died, this isn't really a good decision, and he says that multiple times. But after Aunt May passes out, it cuts to him upstairs with Gwen Stacy and Miles Morales, and they're just kind of having this cute little conversation. And they kind of explain everything, and it's a really, really good closure scene for the Ultimate Universe's Parker family. Nick Fury shows up at the house and tells Peter and Miles it's time to go. Now, while all this has been happening, Nick Fury has gone to the Ultimate Universe's version of Tony Stark, just to kind of figure out how Peter Parker ended up in their universe in the first place. And Tony Stark basically uses his Tony Stark powers to locate that universe's version of Mysterio's warehouse. So both Spider-Man, Nick Fury, and the Ultimates, namely Hawkeye and Thor, so they basically go to Mysterio's warehouse and confront Mysterio. This is kind of wrapping up this story. The Spider-Man take on Mysterio, Miles takes him out, and Peter says goodbye and gives Miles some advice, and it's really funny, like the different advice he gives. But basically that wraps up the Spider-Man story. From there we jump into the comic book Spider-Verse story, and I said I was going to get into it, but upon reading it, Miles' role in that is not as significant as I first thought. The interesting thing is that he meets up with Peter Parker again, he's introduced to all the other Spider people, and I guess I might go into it a little bit more as kind of a bonus video after the movie comes out as a comparison. I think I'll combine that with my review of the movie probably Friday. So kind of towards the wrap up of this, we're going to get into Secret Wars, which again isn't super relevant because Miles' role in it is kind of just he's there. But the joke around the time that this story was written, which is 2015, was that the whole purpose of it was just to bring Miles Morales into the main Marvel universe, which is not far from the truth. Miles' Ultimate comics were huge sales. They were basically the only ones that were getting huge sales. And Marvel had a huge plan in mind for what they were going to do with the future of their comics. So after the events of Secret Wars, Miles is transitioned into the mainstream Marvel universe, his mom is resurrected, and he starts basically a new life. He joins the Avengers, forms a new team of young, diverse versions of the traditional Avengers teams called the Champions. So I think that's a pretty good explanation of Miles Morales as a character and everything that's relevant to the Spider-Verse movie that's coming out Thursday. Again, I'm so excited for it. Now, let's go into what's coming next. Next time, we're going to discuss Spider-Gwen. Spider-Gwen is an alternate version of Gwen Stacy, and she ends up having a little relationship with Miles, but we'll talk about that next time. So until then, live powerful and live responsible. Thanks for watching. Excelsior.